everybody. Thank you for joining me on this talk, which I've entitled The Breaking Point. Can security keep up with the web's accelerating complexity? My name is Jerry Hoff, and it is a pleasure to be here today to speak with all of you. So the focus of this talk specifically is to raise attention on a couple key points. First of all, I want to talk about browsers. They're getting more powerful all the time. It's not your daddy's browser anymore. Browsers these days have immense capabilities, growing capabilities, and I don't think that a lot of security folks are really paying attention to the new capabilities, and what they're doing is they're circumventing existing security controls. I also want to talk about the fact that the attack surface is growing. It's always been growing. That's nothing new, but it's growing even more, especially with the advent of AI-generated code, which we will talk about. And I want to get into the fact that the economics are changing for the attackers. What used to cost a lot on the attacker side is now costing very little. So the ROI is changing quite a bit, and we're going to talk about that. Essentially, low-hanging fruit is even lower, and what used to be medium-hanging fruit is now low-hanging fruit. So we are going to get into that, and I really don't think that really anyone is prepared for what I think is about to happen in the world of application security. So who am I? My name is Jerry Hoff, just your average APPSEC guy. I've been doing technology for 25 years. I have a master's in computer science. I've done application security and information security across a wide range of companies. As you can see up here, I made a startup to find application security, like code level vulnerabilities. I sold it to White Hat Security back in 2011. I was head of security at Sony. I was a global security architect at NTT. And I've been a OWASP volunteer and lifetime member for a long time. And very proud I was the 2015 Web Application Security Person of the Year back in those days. So it is a pleasure to have this chance to speak with you all. So let's get into application security from the beginning. So I just want to mention AppSec lives in a strange world. The reason I say that is because on the network, CISOs can put in security controls. You can monitor. You can pull logs in. You've got a lot of control and visibility on the network because you can interact with the functions that are existent and ambient within the operating system, the hardware, the software, et cetera, your cloud provider. So that world of like network security and cloud security is kind of on one side of the puzzle, let's say. However, applications are extremely complex. So all applications are operating systems, et cetera, but your custom applications, your web applications, your web APIs, et cetera, it's usually, even for the developers who are creating the system, it's complicated and it's complex. So CISOs tend to take a hands-off approach when it comes to those applications. If you think about your average company, you might have dozens, you might have hundreds, you might have thousands of web applications sitting out there. There isn't like a single button a CISO can click and say, I want to monitor the activity across all of these web applications. Now they can monitor the operating system that maybe is, the base computer where the web application server is running, where the web application is running. There's things like that, but the web application itself is generally a black box in most organizations. So, and again, I think, and I'm going to talk about this in a moment, this kind of paradigm between network security and application security and kind of a different way of thinking. But it is a black box for most organizations. So you probably have heard of the OWASP Top 10. I'm sure everybody in this talk has heard about that. What's funny about the OWASP Top 10 is it was started in 2004 by my former boss, Jeff Williams, who's now the CTO over at Contrast Security. And he really did it after watching, from what he told me was he was watching David Letterman, and he thought, hey, maybe I should make a top 10 for application security to try to cut through some of this complexity. And it was successful enough that it became almost the standard for application security around the world. I see all sorts of vendors and security bullet points and requirements saying, hey, we confirm with the OWASP Top 10. But it wasn't meant to be a universal set of an exhaustive list of vulnerabilities. It was really just meant to kind of get you started, right? It was a starter list of the top 10. But it did become this standard for AppSec, which is pretty interesting to me. The reality, though, is you have a huge number of potential vulnerabilities in web applications. It's almost ad infinitum how deep it actually goes. So that brings me to my soapbox. So I want to talk about business as usual in AppSec from my point of view, from what I see out there. When I look at AppSec, the net is it's a giant mess, in my opinion, from what I see. It's a really, really hairy problem for organizations to solve. One reason is most people who work in application security, not all, clearly not all, myself, for example, not, but most people come from a network security or they come from a system administration background. And so they start there and then they work their way up to, security and CISO and so forth. Application security is probably best understood by people who come from a development background. So you do have people come from a development background and people who come from a system administration background are going to see, different problems, and they're going to come to different ways of handling those problems. And I can speak from experience. I'm really talking about my experience here. I come from a development background, and so the way that I look at security is highly colored by application development. And so I tend to look, in that way. And I'll explain a little bit more about what that means in just a moment. But there's definitely and you can see it if you kind of look for it, definitely a different way of thinking from people who come from a system administration background versus an application development background. So one example of that is when I talk to people about what are you doing for application security, right? The business as usual is usually things like, well, we give our developers training, or we do secure development training using e-learning, or we scan it. We scan the source code, or we have a WAF, right? All those are good, but you can kind of see that they're all kind of focused on network security paradigms, which is scanning and potentially pen testing. Those are all necessary. But my point is applications are extremely complex, and it often requires human level creativity and human level ingenuity to kind of take the pieces of each individual web application and put them together in very interesting exploits. Now, of course, we all know things like cross-site scripting, CSRF. I mean, that, app authentication issues, authorization issues, etc. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about taking all those various maybe low-level or medium-level vulnerabilities and putting them together in some malicious way. On top of your obvious things like, your SQL injections. Hopefully there's not a lot of those out there anymore, but, those are smash and grabs. My point is that there's a lot of vulnerabilities that are not going to be found just by your standard scan, potentially pen test, your top application, and your secure coding training that you're doing every year. Vulns are also expensive to fix. So we find vulns all the time in web applications, but they're really, really hard to fix because think about it. The team that's working on, let's say, an application, they already have a backlog. They're usually extremely overworked, and there's usually way more functionality that they have to put in than they have time for. So by taking them off of new functionality and putting them on fixing these vulns, it's very costly, and they're not usually experts in how to defend applications in the first place. So asking them to say, hey, here's some vulns. I want you to go ahead and take these vulns, figure out how to fix those vulns while you're away from helping the company to make money. It's expensive. And so as a result, most organizations, and this is the truth, most organizations usually just focus on your criticals and high vulnerabilities. And the mediums are often, some organizations do mediums as well. It depends on the risk tolerance, but most of the time, your high, your criticals and your highs. And then even there's going to be some horse trading and negotiation as to what really constitutes a critical and high, et cetera. But there are numerous lower level vulnerabilities across the world in every organization on the planet that just are not being addressed, which is a little bit business as usual. And then the last point I'll put about business as usual is decommissioning. A lot of organizations leave applications kind of in production indefinitely. So what happens is over time, or maybe an application is less used, maybe it's a marketing and sales website, maybe it's a whatever it happens to be, it's out there. Over time, the value of that site might go down, right? Companies have thousands of websites. There's going to be some where they're not highly used, but the risk is actually going to go up because you've got third-party libraries in there with known vulnerabilities, or you have vulnerabilities just that were not discovered and they are discovered over time, et cetera. At that point, the development team is probably long gone. Nobody even really is kind of monitoring this application anymore. And it's just out there adding risk to the application. To the organization. All right. So that's kind of a 10,000 foot view of where we are with APPSEC. Now, the situation's getting worse, in my opinion. The two major things I want to add to this, this formula is, number one, our browsers are becoming more and more capable. They're actually amazing. You can live and do most of your work now almost all day without even jumping into a thick client. You have all of your Office suite is all in the browser. Your email is all in the browser. That's obvious stuff. But things like video editing is now done in browsers, and like Canva and Photoshop are now browser-based. You've got gaming, you've got development environments, right? Developers now can do all their development and deployment and everything in a browser. So the browser is becoming that central, almost like mini operating system. It becomes the focal point of the entire, your entire computing endeavors for the end user. And as a result, the browsers have more and more capabilities. And I just don't know, and I don't hear often people talking enough about, hey, these new capabilities in the browsers, can they circumvent our existing security controls? Well, spoiler, they can. And it's just something that I think we need to have more awareness on. At the same time, AI, everybody's favorite topic for the last couple of years, is changing the entire risk landscape in a couple of ways that I'll talk about in this talk. Number one, and I'll get into this in just a moment, but number one, it is going to create a lot more source code. So there's a lot of more things that are going to be potentially out there helping your organization potentially make money and be more productive, but at the same time, adding more invisible risk. And then at the same time, AI will be helping the bad guys as well. So it's a double-edged sword. So let's get into the fact that the browser isn't just a browser anymore. So there are all sorts of new protocols, new functionality that the browser has that are probably not very well understood. Things like things like WebAssembly, WASM, things like gRPC, web workers, web sockets, web transport. I mean, it goes on and on. WebRTC. There's all of these functionalities and all of these new capabilities that maybe security researchers are looking at, but I think a lot of CISOs are still looking at the browser like it's a very basic renderer of HTML, CSS, and a little bit of JavaScript. And the JavaScript really has like very basic functionality. The truth is, it's not that way anymore. It really is. I mean, JavaScript, since I started, my first exposure to JavaScript was back in, it's kind of embarrassing now, but probably 1997, 1998, something around those times. But it's now like a first-class language. It can do so many things. And there's all sorts of new attacks on the browser. So, things like sync checking, those are now becoming popular, where the capability of browsers to sync from various accounts is getting compromised, and the attackers are starting to focus on that. There's been some, you can look up, if you look up sync checking, you look in the news, you will see many, you'll see some situations that people are getting popped on this. You got things like the last mile reassembly attack, which means malware can be brought into an organization, slipping by things like your typical SASE controls and so forth, simply by cutting something up into pieces, sending it through these various channels, reassembling it on the browser, dropping it into the operating system, or at least recreating like an Office document, and then waiting for somebody to open that where it will take advantage of the operating system at that point. And those are areas that are often overlooked by your XDR and EDR. So there's a lot of stuff that's going on with the browser. And I just really want, I want to kind of get this message out that it really needs to be treated as a first-class citizen, which is kind of one of the major points of this talk. It's also been a while since we've had like the last, browser hacker's handbook. That must have been like 10 years ago when the last one came out, published by Wiley. So I'm really hoping the last one was 600 pages. I think with all the new functionality that web browsers have, the next one will have to be double that, but hopefully that is in the works. At the same time, we've got what I'm going to call an exploding code base. So when just like I'm sure most of you, the first thing when I had access to, when OpenAI kind of came into the public consciousness, first thing I asked it to do was help me just generate some code, write a Python program that does X, and it did, which was pretty amazing. I think a lot of developers are now using AI. They're leveraging AI to generate code, which is great. It's going to make your expert developers even more efficient because they're going to have the expertise to look at the generated code, see what's missing, right? The code might work functionally, but it might not be enterprise level in terms of security or even other aspects as well. So you are going to have an ever-growing number of applications, even more than ever before with AI help. It's also going to empower your junior developers. The problem is the junior developers might not recognize the missing pieces. So as AI generates code, there have been a number of academic studies shown on the code quality and security of AI generated code. Spoiler, it's not that secure. So junior developers might not realize all the security controls and changes that need to be made on that AI code before they put it into production environment. And then probably even most scary, people who are today not writing any code at all, right? Non-developers. It's not scary from a productivity point of view, but from a security point of view, it's scary that those folks will be generating lots of code. And I see already a lot of evidence of this where people who have never written a line of code in their life will be using AI to generate code. They'll figure out how to run it. And if those wind up in a way that either a production environment or in a situation that could be compromised by attackers, again, you've just got this ever increasing attack surface that I don't know that we're really focused on at the moment. At the same time, AI is also going to be empowering the bad guys. So by empowering the bad guys, essentially it changes the ROI equation. So if you think about the ROI that the bad guys have today, they essentially want to get, they want to achieve their objectives with the minimal cost to themselves. So the way that normally is done is a lot of the bad guys depend on tools that are widely available. And think about your Metasploits and tools like that, where you've got somebody around the world who writes an exploit, and then many people can use that exploit. So when you're talking about Microsoft operating systems or standard environments, you can have that gigantic ROI where one person writes an exploit and then it can be used by everybody. Web applications, web APIs, mobile applications, they're different. Those exploits have to be usually customized to that specific application and that specific vulnerability. So that's one reason why a lot of the existing ambient vulnerabilities in web applications are not being exploited today because the economics are just not there. So in other words, although there are many vulnerabilities in many applications in production today in companies all over the world, around the world, they're not being exploited as much as you think that they would be, because simply the attackers don't want to go through the problem or the trouble of writing custom exploits for finding these vulnerabilities and writing exploits for them. But AI is going to change that economic model. So if you can have AI for, pennies finding and writing custom exploits for web applications, you are going to see, in my opinion, a vast increase of attacks against web applications, which in the past, maybe were not there. So adding it all up, is it the end of the world? No, but it's going to make our jobs a lot more complicated. Browsers are vastly more powerful than they used to be. The application attack surface is growing by leaps and bounds, and it is going to be vastly cheaper for attackers to find and exploit application security vulnerabilities that in the past may have been overlooked. So it's a little bit depressing, but that's where I see it. That's where I kind of see everything going. So what do we do? Like, how do we kind of defend ourselves? There's probably a lot of angles you could take with this and a lot of things, but if I kind of look at, okay, what is going to be your Pareto principle 80-20 rule? I would say to defend our employees within an organization, we probably need to treat the browser as a first-class citizen. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. And then we also have to get a lot more serious about truly automating security throughout the SDLC. So secure the browser. That was the first thing that I mentioned. Like I said, the browser is like the new operating system. It's really complicated. It's really complex. Right now, maybe organizations have like a SASE, or they might be using a CASB, and they have some, minimal controls, usually by looking at the traffic in order to secure, what they call browser security. But the browser itself needs kind of more policies baked in. So, you really need to figure out ways where you can do monitoring, policy enforcement, and security controls in the browser itself. That will help your users out. Right now, I think a lot of users, a lot of employees are kind of flying blind in terms of how do we use this browser in a safe and efficient way. And if you've ever, spent some time watching people use their browsers, or actually their computers in general, but browsers specifically, you'll see that not everything is always up to the most high level of security. So definitely figuring out ways where we can get a lot more policy enforcement in the browser. Monitoring in the browser is going to be vital for the future. And like I said before, we have to evolve past we'll just deal with the critical and high vulnerabilities. We have to really get good at remediating and using AI and automation to not just detect vulnerabilities, but to create fixes and custom essentially custom patches for our web applications, so that we get a lot better at tightening down these ambient vulnerabilities that are out there before AI figures out, even more so than in the past, how to exploit these. Also, I really want organizations to get more serious about knowing their attack surface. If you talk to CISOs, in a Chatham House Rules environment, almost everybody will tell you nobody really understands how many web applications they have out there. Their attack surface is right now not very well known, and it's growing. And it's going to be growing even more now with AI empowerment. So I really want to kind of get that message across. And then also get more on decommissioning. It goes part and parcel with, if you don't know your attack surface, you're really not going to know what really old applications are out there, which are causing risk, and the risk reward to some of these applications is probably vastly in the negative. So we have to get a little bit better at decommissioning as well. So that's basically it. Just to summarize, prepare yourself for more attacks exploiting browser functionality. Prepare for even a larger attack surface, more web apps, more APIs, more mobile applications that are going to help your business, but yet cause risk at the same time. Browser needs to be protected and treated like a first-class citizen, and we all have to do, and I'm talking to myself, talking to everybody, we have to do a better job of tightening up our SDLC. And that is it for the presentation. Again, hopefully you enjoyed it. Reach out to me on LinkedIn. That's probably the best way to talk to me if you have any other questions. And I thank you all very much, and have a wonderful rest of the day.